and his will to dominate all life. One ring to rule them all.
Welcome back to Marvelous Videos. I'm Rylan. It's impossible to talk about The Lord of the Rings without mentioning the rings themselves. Constructed by the unsuspecting elves of Middle-earth and under the watchful eye of Sauron, who then proceeded to create the One Ring later on, the Rings of Power were intended to seduce the world's rulers to evil so that Sauron could control them. The rings, which were destructive, coercive, and irresistible to most mortal minds, were given to the nations of Middle-earth by Sauron in the expectation that its leaders would succumb to the ring seduction and become easier to rule. The One Ring, which Sauron wanted to keep for himself, was capable of both destroying and controlling all the other Rings of Power. Following completion of the first season of the Rings of Power, it seems only appropriate to revisit the history and significance of each of these extraordinary rings. But before we go into our explanation, however, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is just a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thanks. Now, let's begin. An early history of the rings. Initially, the Rings of Power were actually Tolkien's background tale, developed based on the ring that debuted in The Hobbit. In one of the earliest iterations, the Dark Master, and not the elves of Eregion, created numerous rings and dispersed them to trap others. There is no indication of the elves realizing the Lord of the Rings objective and removing their rings. Instead, it is stated that there are now a large number of elf wraiths. The elves had numerous rings, instead of just 3. Instead of Isildur, the ring that Bilbo later discovered fell from the ring of an elf, but the rest of the factors, that he managed to flee from his pursuers in a battle, and that the ring backstabbed him and slipped from his finger when he tried to swim across a river, allowing him to be seen by the goblins who killed him, were also present in this manuscript. Rather than a hobbit named Deagle discovered the ring and utilized its effect to render him invisible for nefarious intentions, becoming known as Gollum and being forced to flee by his people. The ideas that the dwarves had 7 rings and how they only made them selfish, as well as the fact that the gold ring was the basis of each of the dwarves' 7 hordes, were already existing. However, it is not said that the dwarves were difficult to control, that their minds could not be read, or that they were unable to be transformed into wraiths. It is just stated that the rings could not render them invisible. The goblins had specific rings, and their wraiths were extremely wicked and entirely under the control of the Dark Master. Men had received 3 rings instead of 9, but they had discovered more rings in secret locations that elf wraiths had thrown away. The men wraiths served the Dark Master and returned their rings to him. The legend of the rings, particularly the one, has since been frequently connected to the Ring of the Nibelungs, despite Tolkien's denial of any direct inspiration. Additionally, it has been mentioned in an earlier version that the bearer of the rings becomes permanently invincible, that everything becomes exceptionally dim for them, and they have a sense of smell more vividly than they can listen or say things. As well, they can transform into a ring wraith at the bidding of the Lord of the Rings. It is also stated that they lack the ability to make things unseen, and their garments are visible. In contemporary writing, the Rings of Power are 20 magical rings constructed in the Second Age by Sauron to entice Middle-earth's rulers to evil. 19 rings were created, 3 for the elves, 7 for the dwarves, and 9 for the men. Sauron at Mount Doom fashioned a new, ultimately powerful ring called the One Ring. The bearer of each of these rings could be influenced by the One, and if the One were eliminated, their abilities would decrease, along with the strength of the rest of the Rings of Power. Thus, the strength of the One was tied to and dependent on the 19 smaller rings. Around the year 1200, Sauron began to poison the elves. He was unable to approach Gil-galad or Elrond, but he had more success with the elven smiths in Eregion. The majority of the Gwaithemedryon of Eregion were Noldor, who longed to experience the same delights of Middle-earth, like the elves who had journeyed to Valinor. The Rings of Power were the creation of the Gwaithemedryon, led by Celebrimbor, Feanor's grandson. The motivation of their development came through Sauron, who was able to assume a form convincing enough to fool at least a few of the elves at the time. Sauron had disguised himself as Anatar, an ambassador from the Valar, and seduced the elves by promising the wisdom needed to alter Middle-earth. Anatar showed the smiths how to make rings, which granted the elves who wore them special abilities. Initially, many minor rings were produced, as recorded by Gandalf and in the Silmarillion. However, these were widely regarded as a simple experiment on the craft, an exercise of the smiths. The elves ended up constructing a total of 19 Rings of Power, 16 of which Sauron crafted personally. The Great 16 were formed in the year 1500. When Anatar left Eregion, Celebrimbor used the information he received from him to build the finest 3 rings all by himself, although without his input, and finished them about 1590 SA. Sauron, on the other hand, intended to utilize the rings to rule over the last elves of Middle-earth. In line with this, he stealthily created the One Ring in the flames of Mount Doom, hoping to subjugate all rings and their bearers. However, when the elves heard Sauron utter the spell during the construction of the One, they recognized that they had been deceived. When Sauron placed the ruling ring on his hand, the elves became aware of him and immediately removed their own rings out of anger and fear. They refused to wear the rings, openly defying Sauron. Furious at this change of events, Sauron declared open war on the elves and ordered that the rings be returned to him. He sought to seize the rings in order to redistribute them to other people. Despite the elves' brave efforts, Eregion was destroyed. Luckily for the elves, they managed to conceal the Great Three and pass one on to Khazad-dûm dwarves. Celebrimbor discreetly handed the 3 he constructed to Círdan, Galadriel, and Gil-galad. They were initially bestowed to the 3 finest Eldar of the period in Middle-earth. Sauron snatched 9 rings and bestowed other minor works from their possession in the sack of Eregion, but he couldn't discover the rest. Then, Celebrimbor was tortured, and he divulged the identities of the 7 of them. Thus, Sauron retrieved the remaining 15. He then handed them to the mortal men and the dwarves. 6 he gave to the dwarves, making their rings 7 in total, but 9 he gave to men, recognizing how easily they would yield to his will. The men who were most obedient to his wishes became great sorcerers and kings. These mannish rulers who possessed the 9 were destroyed by them and reincarnated as ring wraiths, slaves of Sauron without agency. The rings made the dwarves greedier, which made them selfishly increase their possessions. The dwarves who possessed the 7 were mostly, but not entirely, unscathed. Yet, their fury and greed created calamities that benefited Sauron. Because Sauron was involved in their creation, he readily distorted and corrupted the rings, deceiving those who bore them. The elves and Gandalf always remained in charge of the 3. These 3 remaining elven rings were secreted away from Sauron. They were still tied to the One Ring, and whoever wore the one could see the emotions of those who carried the 3 with some effort. They were not meant to be deadly weapons or to oppress others. Instead, they were made to protect the lovely elven realms in which their bearers lived, as well as to help in healing and combating evil. As a result, the elves did not utilize these rings as long as Sauron had the One Ring. Sauron assisted in the creation of the 7 and the 9. Therefore, their abilities and impacts on their bearers were likely comparable, even though each group was different. The Similarian implies that Sauron just granted men 9 of the 16 lesser rings, since they were easier to manipulate. It is vital to remember that the reason the 7 did not overpower the dwarves is due to the dwarves' own tenacity, and not the rings. Also, according to the Similarian, the 7 rings of dwarves were not radically different from the 9 rings handed to men, because Sauron originally intended for both the 7 and the 9 to dwell in elven hands. The consequences of one of the 9 on a dwarf are likely to be identical to any of those of the 7, and if a man wielded one of the 7, he would almost certainly become a wraith. It remains to be revealed whether they differed in their impact on their bearers or in the abilities they bestowed. Unfinished Tales also mentions that the 7 were formed before the 9. Even in other writings, although their powers may be similar, the 9 and the 7 are referred to as separate sets. In the Third Age, 4 of the 7 were destroyed in dwarven dragon battles, and following Sauron's return, he reclaimed the remaining 3, the last one from Therne II. He reclaimed the 9 from the Ringwraiths, and they continue to be in his custody throughout the War of the Ring. Nothing is known about the fates of the minor rings, which were fashioned as experiments in the art, but, as per Gandalf, were still deadly to mortals who could have discovered them. The one was lost and rediscovered several times before being obliterated in the Crack of Doom. The other rings were set free from Sauron's influence, although their strength may have been impacted. Coincidentally, the date of Tolkien's death actually corresponds to how many rings were awarded to each species: 1973. The 1 ring for Sauron, 9 rings for men, 7 rings for dwarves, and 3 rings for elves.
7 to the Dwarf Lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls.
The Dwarven 7 Rings. Sauron is said to have presented 6 rings to the Lord of the 7 Dwarven Houses, in the guise of Anatar. However, Dwarvish legend holds that the elves bestowed another on Durin III. Celebrimbor was believed to have given the ring to Durin III, king of Durin's folk, prior to the downfall of Eregion. However, this seems implausible given that Celebrimbor was reported to have surrendered the 7, all the 7, to Sauron after interrogation. The dwarves constructed their rich hoards with the 7 rings, but Sauron could not force the Dwarven wearers to succumb. The overall impact of these rings was to deliver immense wealth to the bearer, while simultaneously intensifying their greed, resulting in the wielder's destruction. It is claimed that the dwarves' innate resilience, as well as the fact that they were exclusively owned by the most powerful dwarf lords, rendered them immune to Sauron's control, while still allowing them to collect gold. The dwarves employed their rings to build their famed treasure hoards, which lured dragons, but Sauron was unable to persuade the dwarven carriers to bow to his will, according to parts of the Silmarillion. Moreover, the rings couldn't even make the dwarves invisible, and the dwarves were resistant to some of the more harmful effects of the rings. While it's not explicitly stated, the rings may have given the dwarf lords who held them a longer lifespan. Dragons consumed or destroyed 4 of the dwarfs' rings, but Sauron managed to find 2. The mightiest of the 7 was with Durin III, and was carried down from father to son until it was finally taken from Thern II, Durin's heir, who was caught, imprisoned, and tortured by the Necromancer, which was actually Sauron in pretense, in 2845 TA. Shortly before the War of the Ring began, Sauron's envoy met Dane Ironfoot in the Lonely Mountain, and promised to return the 3 surviving rings to the dwarves in exchange for their assistance in finding the one ring. Dane declined, knowing from dwarven experience that Sauron could not be trusted. The 7 appear when dwarf rulers wear them in the opening of The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring. They are fashioned in keeping with the overall dwarven style of the film, with angular crystalline forms. However, nowhere in Tolkien's works is it stated that the 7 were created for the dwarves.
And 9. 9 rings were gifted to the race of men.
The 9 rings for mortal men. The 9 rings, like the rest of the Rings of Power, were created in Eregion by Elven smiths, underneath the direction of Sauron. They were stored in the House of the Myrdain, but Sauron took all rings, except the 3 Elven rings when he stormed Eregion. He presented 9 of these to men, and 3 of those who got them were supposed to be Númenórean lords, and another from the east. The 9 were distributed among the evil-hearted men, who watched their powers grow and rose to become witches and kings among men. They fell under Sauron's eternal control one by one due to the character of the man and his natural incapacity to resist evil, and turned into wraiths who performed only Sauron's bidding. They possessed the capability to turn invisible, and their lifetimes were abnormally extended. It is said that after a while, life became unbearable for them, and so, when they put on the rings, they frequently saw the phantoms and illusions of Sauron. They grew old, but gradually faded away and became the ring wraiths, or the Nazgul, ruled by Sauron's desire. They were only visible to whoever donned the ruling ring, though it's uncertain if the other rings bestowed this power, except for those elves who had formerly lived in the Undying Lands, who were few by the Third Age, and Maiar, such as the wizards and Sauron, were remained eternally invisible. This act also appeared to connect their existence and abilities with Sauron's, reducing them to little more than projections of his will. When Sauron's might was feeble, the wraiths were also weak. However, as Sauron became stronger, they grew much more deadly, to the point where the Witch King was probably strong enough to challenge Gandalf the White. Except for their commander, the Witch King of Angmar, none are particularly addressed in The Lord of the Rings. In the unfinished tales, his second in command was known as Khamûl, or the Black Everlasting. It is unknown whether the 9 rings were held. This suggests that, at the very least, the Nazgul did not wear their rings all the time, though they may sometimes do so. When the Nazgul are revealed, there's no discussion of any of the 9, and when the Witch King is murdered, Tolkien doesn't depict him carrying a ring, nor do Gandalf and Aragorn show any worry about what became of the ring afterwards. The past of the Rings of Power is addressed before the Council of Elrond, and it is reported that Sauron gathered the 9 for himself. However, it is also mentioned that the 9 are kept by the Nazgul. This might suggest that the Nazgul wore their rings when in Sauron's service, or that once they succumbed and became slave to his will, Sauron removed their rings and held them in Barad-dûr, as he did with the dwarf rings, and assigned the Nazgul to safeguard them. Furthermore, Frodo sees no rings on them on Weathertop, and it's assumed that if they had worn the rings, they would have become entirely invisible, even their cloaks. The passage in the Council of Elrond likely symbolizes Tolkien's previous idea that the Nazgul should always wear their rings. If so, he subsequently altered his mind and simply forgot to revise that statement. Tolkien's epitaph phrase, 9 for mortal men, doomed to die, alludes to the fate of men, who are the only creations of Eru to pass past Arda to a future unknown to the elves. Sauron took advantage of this ambiguity, as well as men's jealousy to elven eternity in the Blessed Realm, to destroy Númenor. What is special about the One Ring? Sauron's One Ring is, of course, the most renowned, powerful, and valuable ring of power. The ring, which Sauron secretly crafted in the depths of Mount Doom, has the ability to govern the 16 rings possessed by dwarves and men. His jurisdiction over the remaining rings was imperfect, but he invested a significant portion of his own strength in its making, a provision that subsequently led to his demise at the hands of Frodo Baggins. Sauron's original plan was to bestow the rings to powerful and influential elves. The reason Sauron sought to construct the One Ring was because it would give him direct authority over the minds of the remaining ring bearers by the smaller rings. Sauron's plan was to use the rings of power to control the actions of all the other ring bearers and use them to his benefit. But for this plan to succeed, the ruling ring had to be substantially more potent than all the other rings, so Sauron invested a considerable portion of his own might into the ring to accomplish this. While Sauron's scheme didn't go exactly as planned, the presence of the One Ring on his hand meant that the remaining rings, with which many realms had been established, could not be utilized so freely. Being the ruling ring, it possessed all the other rings' abilities, but at a much higher level. Plus, it had several abilities that were unique to it. Furthermore, whether on purpose or not, Sauron's own strength was substantially boosted while he wore the ring, granting him military might that he could never have had otherwise. If things had gone ideally, Sauron would have dominated the elves without the need for military action. We first encountered the ring when Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, discovers Smeagol dwelling underneath the Misty Mountains. Bilbo acquires the ring by accident and keeps it with him until the culmination of his travels. The one was then passed from generation to generation to Frodo Baggins, who was compelled to flee to Rivendell while being pursued by the Nazgul. He was picked there to do the one thing that Isildur should have done in the first place, and decimate the One in the flames of Mount Doom. Frodo eventually failed in his attempt to demolish the One Ring, following a long and grueling trip. The ring prevented Frodo in the Sammath Naur, where its influence was most significant, and he attempted to keep it for himself. Coming back to Isildur, he was initially the one who severed Sauron's ring from his hand. He had the chance to dispose the one in the vaults where it was formed, but he was twisted by the ring and chose to save it. It later betrayed him, causing his death. Deagol, a Stor, discovered it 2,500 years later and was immediately entranced by it. Deagol was then assassinated by his cousin Smeagol, who was also enchanted and was under the ring's control. Smeagol was soon corrupted, although he possessed a tremendous physical resilience to the ring, which poisoned his mind for over 500 years. He was later known as the infamous Gollum, who claimed the ring for himself and was ultimately the cause of its decimation. Smeagol appeared behind a disillusioned Frodo, who was finally under the control of the ring, chewed off his hand with the ring, and threw himself into the flames below, defeating Sauron and decimating the One Ring. Samwise Gamgee also previously held the ring to preserve it after discovering Frodo supposedly dead when they were on the quest to destroy the ring, but Sam relinquishes the ring after finding Frodo alive. The One Ring seemed to have a will all of its own, or at least the capability of carrying out Sauron's will independently, as it housed a massive piece of his existence and could expand or contract on its own to allow different species to wear it. It was devoid of gems or elaborate ornamentation compared to the other significant rings, or at least upon first inspection. To the untrained eye, it seems to be a plain golden ring. However, even a tiny fire could show a portion of Sauron's enchantment in an elvish writing scrawled along the ring. Isildur mentions how the lettering could be seen on the ring when Sauron was wearing it. It was essentially indestructible, and neither the elves nor Gandalf could destroy it in any manner. As recounted in the Fellowship of the Ring, Sauron's fingers that bore the ring were black and yet burnt like fire. As shown in the text, Bilbo discovers the One Ring inside Gollum's cave in the Hobbit film. In a deviation from the novel, however, Gandalf reveals that he's aware of Bilbo's custody of the ring, and that it is really the One, laying the groundwork for a film version of The Lord of the Rings. When the ring is placed on, a strange sound is heard for some reason. Alan Howard portrays the One Ring in the Lord of the Rings movie series. It has its reference initially in Galadriel's prologue as the ring that will govern all rings of power, and is shown in the book as a plain gold ring that glows fiery characters on its surface when subjected to fire, with these characters being similar to those drawn in the book. Sauron routs the might of his ring in his mace during the siege of Belladur, throwing off many Last Alliance troops with each swing. It appears to be able to expand or shrink to suit the finger of whoever owns it, a quality mentioned in the novel, as well as to talk, albeit incomprehensibly, into the head of its bearer. 3 Rings of Power for the Elves. Celebrimbor built the 3 rings on his own, and Sauron never touched them. They were made last though, and their forging incorporated some of Anatar's arts. As a result, they were also tied to the One Ring to a certain extent, although they remained concealed from Sauron. They were known as the Ring of Fire, or Narya, the Ring of Adamant, or Nenya, and the Ring of Air, or Vilya. Sauron declared war on Eregion after the elves rejected him, and that is why Celebrimbor quickly sent his 3 rings away for protection. Narya was initially worn by Gil-galad, who passed it to Círdan and then to Gandalf. Gil-galad also owned Vilya before Elrond acquired it when Gil-galad died. Galadriel was the only one who ever wore Nenya. They stayed concealed, and the 3 locations were not made public until the conclusion of the Third Age, once the One Ring was destroyed and Sauron the Dark Lord was deposed. Elrond claimed during the Council of Elrond that neither the Grey Havens, Lorien, nor Rivendell, the sites of the 3 Elven rings, had the strength to oppose Mordor's might. The 3 rings even possessed unique qualities, but their abilities were restricted. Instead of rendering the person invisible, the rings themselves were invisible. After he saw her ring using the One Ring, Galadriel disclosed her ownership of Nenya to Frodo Baggins when he was in Lothlorien. Later, when headed down the Andium River, Frodo mentioned it to Aragorn, who warned him not to mention it anywhere other than Lorien. Similar to Galadriel, Elrond had handled Vilya and was apparently utilizing its abilities to keep Rivendell secure from attack. Their strength dwindled with the ruination of the One Ring, and the 3 became mere relics. During the last riding of the Keepers, their carriers left Middle-earth aboard the White Ship, unable to stop time and maintain the High Elven wisdom and beauty. The Third Age came to an end, and the Age of Men had started. Narya appears on Gandalf's finger in the extended version of The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, when an orc attempts to hack off his hand in order to claim it for Sauron. However, Galadriel appears to save Gandalf and defeats the orc just in time. Throughout the action, she can be seen carrying Nenya on her finger. Vilya can be seen on Elrond's finger during the last fight against the Nazgul. The 3 rings are briefly seen being carried by Galadriel, Gil-galad, and Círdan in the opening to the first movie of the Lord of the Rings movie franchise. Later in the film, Galadriel discloses to Frodo that she owns Nenya. Although Gandalf is seen wearing Narya at the end of the film, its importance is never explained. Which rings can you see in Rings of Power? The 3 Elven rings were created at the conclusion of Rings of Power season finale, each of the 3 having their own unique characteristics and properties. Each of the 3 is distinct in its own way, yet all of them unite under the One Ring. The first of these was Narya, which was famously shown as the Ring of Fire. Círdan handed it to Gandalf in the hopes that he would use it to ignite hearts to the heroism of old in a cold world. Gandalf wore Narya openly on his way through the Grey Havens. Círdan had warned Gandalf that his labors and responsibilities would be challenging, but Narya would sustain and protect him from fatigue. The ring was characterized as having the capacity to inspire people, to reject tyranny, dominance, and despair, creating optimism from those around the wielder, which also provided resistance to the stress of time. According to Unfinished Tales, Celebrimbor granted Narya to the Lord of the Havens of Mithlond, Círdan, at the onset of the War of the Elves and Sauron, who retained it after Gil-galad's death. Círdan, understanding Gandalf's real character as a Maiar from Valinor, handed him the ring to help him in his labors in the Third Age. Narya was among the 3 rings introduced in the series and was often referred to as the Ring of Fire or the Red Ring. It was a golden ring with a red ruby set inside it. Nenya, being one of the 3 rings, was powerful in its own right, but the revelation that orcs from Moria invaded Lorien once the Fellowship of the Ring reached the forest, and that Lorien had previously been attacked by Sauron's orcs, dispatched from Dol Guldur, implied that the ring's might did not equate to military prowess. Its name comes from Quenya Nen, which means water. Nenya was stated as being constructed of mithril and studded with a white stone, which was likely a diamond. It is just mere speculation, even though the use of the term adamant, being an ancient synonym, does suggest that this myth could be true. Many versions mention that Galadriel wore it upon her finger, which sounds more magical because it implies that her finger somehow has become translucent when Samwise Gamgee saw it, but the Treason of Isengard, chapter 13, note 45, highlights this term as a mistake. Nenya was also known as the Ring of Adamant, the White Ring, or the Ring of Water. Galadriel transported Nenya to the west aboard a vessel from the Grey Havens, escorted by the other 2 Elven rings, as well as their carriers at the conclusion of the Third Age. Nenya's strength was maintenance, protection, and potentially hiding from evil, but Lorien was said to have a secret power that kept evil at bay. Lothlorien was desolate and in ruins by the day Arwen arrived to die in 121 FO, for the strength of the One Ring waned after its destruction and defeat by Sauron. as did the power of the rest of the Rings of Power. Galadriel utilized the ring's abilities to build and nurture Lothlorien, yet it also heightened her desire for the sea and to travel back to the Undying Lands. It was stated that, despite Nenya's protection, Lothlorien could have crumbled unless Sauron himself came to destroy it. When worn by Galadriel of Lothlorien, the ring had the splendor of the constellations. Because he was a ring bearer, Frodo Baggins could see it, but Samwise Gamgee informed Galadriel that he only saw a star between her fingers. With the ring gone, Lorien's charm and beauty waned, as did the magnificent Malorn woods that had survived for millennia, and the land progressively depopulated. It is logical to assume that Velia, just like Nenya, also had the power to treat and preserve, as Celebrimbor made the three for these purposes, as it is said in the Silmarillion, rather than to increase the strength of each individual bearer, as the 7, 9, and the similar rings did. All this is still speculation, as Velia's actual power was never specified. Given the incident when Elrond conjured a stream of water when the Nazgul sought to overrun Rivendell, some speculate that the ring governed lesser elements. Because Elrond held the talent to foresight, the ring might have had the ability to look into the future. The ring was bestowed upon Elrond after Gil-galad's demise in the War of the Last Alliance, a war throughout the Third Age. Velia was also known as the Ring of Air, indicating its superiority even above the rest of the rings of the elves, as recounted in the concluding section of The Return of the King. At the time of the ring's distribution, the High King of the Noldor was Gil-galad, and it was felt that he was most suited to care for the most important of the three elven rings. When Sauron destroyed Eregion, Velia, along with Nenya, were transported to him. The might of Velia diminished with the destruction of the One Ring, and it was carried over the seas by Elrond at the conclusion of the Third Age. Velia was the greatest of the three rings, and was known as the Blue Ring, the dominant ring, the Ring of Air, or the Ring of Sapphire. Velia, like the other two elven rings, was bejeweled. It had a large blue stone set in a gold ring, which earned its nicknames the Blue Ring or the Ring of Sapphire. The Rings of Power in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings movies. Although only the One Ring appears in all 6 movies, the expanded editions include several allusions to the rest of the Rings of Power, along with a subplot about the fight of the Seven in the Hobbit trilogy. Galadriel displays her own ring to Frodo in the expanded version of The Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring. Gandalf expresses his concerns to the White Council in the extended version of The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey about what Theron's absence means to the outcome of his family's band, as the sole Ring of Power unknown of, with the 9 and 2 of the 7 in Sauron's complete control, and 4 of the 7 being destroyed by dragons. Gandalf's ownership of one of the 3 is revealed as he's being tortured by his Orc Warden in the expanded version of The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies, but he is liberated before the ring is taken from him. The expanded version of The Hobbit: The Desolation of Smaug reveals that Theron's finger was severed during his confinement, confirming Sauron's claim of the last of the 7. What made the rings so powerful? A bearer of any of the Rings of 3 gained the ability to mend and maintain anything they controlled in a variety of ways. The one had the ability to totally transport the bearer to the spirit world, making the corporal body undetectable to mortals. The Rings of Power all had varying but similar vital characteristics. The Rings of Galadriel and Elrond enabled them to repel Sauron and safeguard and maintain Lothlorien and Rivendell. This is why one can conclude that one of the ring's principal abilities was to inhabit and slow down degradation and transformation. The elves of Eregion had indeed built the rings to protect their lands and make them as lovely as Valinor. Furthermore, the One Ring, as well as the 7 and the 9, possessed varying degrees of access to the unseen. The rings also enhanced the bearer's innate skills, presumably providing magical abilities. The 3 did not render the wearers invisible. However, the ring itself could be made invisible. Narya could also instill optimism and bravery in others. The One Ring in particular has such lustful power that no one dared to harm it, despite the fact that it was indestructible. Any ring of power, according to Gandalf, could look after itself. The 9 and the 7 were so wholly under Sauron's influence that they would force the wearer, particularly men, to decay and transform into a wraith. The person who wore the One Ring would not develop or gain additional life. They would just continue to live until it became unbearable. Although the dwarves weren't outwardly affected by any of the rings, they utilized their 7 rings to expand their wealth troves. These dwarves' treasure hoards enticed the fiercest of dragons and adversaries, which ultimately benefited Sauron. They also generally suffered from a heightened desire for gold, which caused them to squabble with one another. Also, according to Gandalf, one universal aspect of the Rings of Power was that a mortal who bore any of the rings was guaranteed a lifetime, much beyond their normal one. Bilbo Baggins claimed near the conclusion of his possession of the One Ring that he started to feel weak and stretched, a clue that the process of owning the ring was beginning to impact him. This is more likely an unforeseen consequence of the ring's strength, as Sauron intended for all the rings to be possessed by elves, who were ageless to begin with. A ring bearer could not reject it, but a ring may choose to abandon its wearer, as the One Ring did numerous times in order to return to Sauron. Conclusion. Because so many of Sauron's rings are shrouded in mystery, the topic is ideal for examination in The Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power. The Amazon show will most likely cover the majority of the events surrounding the rings, up until Sauron's initial destruction by Elendil at the conclusion of the Second Age. But how the events unfold remains a mystery. We know that the show's writers compressed the history so that characters from several ages of Middle-earth can be living at the same time. This does seem logical for a TV show's plot, but it also makes us worry about what other liberties they might take. Will the Rings of Power tale unfold precisely as it does in the chapters of The Lord of the Rings, or will there be further surprises? I guess we'll just have to wait and find out once Season 2 of The Rings of Power is available on Amazon Prime Video. If you enjoyed our content, then please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe.